Hello everyone, I am Alex. Thank you very much for joining. My talk today will be what to study and how to approach it in 2026. I chose this topic because, first of all, it's something that a lot of people have been asking me for a pretty long time. But then also, it's something that I think even if you don't necessarily play a lot of tournaments, you can still get something out of. So, let's get started. First, Alex, what do I study? Main question. I've heard this so many times. There is an infinite ocean of things to study. Where do I begin? What do I focus on first? And the truth is, there is not one answer that will satisfy everyone. Your game will be on a different level. You will be playing different stakes. So there are a lot of factors to keep in mind. The main ones are these three. First factor. How often does the sport I want to study actually come up in game? The more common it is, the more often it comes up, the more I should prioritize it, because as it comes up more often, I need to be better at it. Making mistakes on a common sport will just end up hurting my win rate a lot more than making a mistake in a random, obscure situation that's only going to happen very rarely. So, first factor, how often does the sport actually come up? Second factor, also very important. How expensive are mistakes in the sport? How important is it in dollar EV to actually get it right? So this comes at a bit of a conflict with the first one, because some of the more obscure sports also end up being more expensive because more money have gone into the pot. So this is also something we need to weigh in when coming up on a decision on what to study. And then the third factor is how good am I already in this sport I'm considering studying? The better I am, the less I need to study it. But let's elaborate. First, how often does the sport actually come up? For that, it is important to understand the frequency that sports occur. Every sport we face occurs at a different frequency, is less or more common than others. As an example for that, I have this database of a student on PokerStracker, and I'm just going to show you some frequencies. So here, this is about 100K hands of a sample size. And let's take one very common spot. That would be defending the big blind against an open from the bottom. So this would be here. So how often do we get to defend the big blind against an open from the bottom? And we can see that this happens, let's say, 1.5 thousand times. So it's a very big portion of the total hands we play. Then also, let's say, folding against the c-bet from the big blind. Also something that comes up very often. And if we go to this statistic, again, it doesn't matter what the value is. I'm just trying to show you how often the spot occurs. So fold to flop c-bet from the big blind, we see this happens about 3,000 times in this 100K sample size. So about 3% of the hands we play are facing a c-bet from the big blind. So this is one of, if not the most common post-flop spot that we will face. In contrast, let's say facing a river c-bet, so this means someone barreling 3 times from the big blind. In this hand history sample size only comes up 77 times. So this is like 0.08% of the time or something. So this happens 0.08% of the time, but we face a river c-bet, whereas a flop c-bet, we face 3% of our total hands. So hopefully this just paints a picture of how different a spot can occur. Another example would be, let's say, c-betting flops. Let's say in a single raise spot, how often do we get to c-bet the flop from the bottom? So we open the bottom, big blind or small blind defense, and we get to c-bet the flop. How often does this happen? Well, it would happen around 900 times here. So it's about 1% of our total hands are c-betting the flop from the bottom in a single raised pot. But now, what if it is a 3-bet pot? So someone opens, we 3-bet, they defend, and then we have to decide if we c-bet the flop. This only happens 148 times. So single raise pots happen like 6 times more often than 3-bet pots when it comes to c-betting. So again, just goes to show that single raised pots just occur so much more often than 3-bet pots. Of course, the most common scenarios that we have will be pre-flop spots. For example, let's say deciding if we should raise from EP. So our opportunity to raise first in from early position in this sample size happens over 17,000 times. So we get the opportunity to raise from early position a very big portion of our total hands. So knowing our pre-flop ranges is just extremely important because it is just the most common thing and also where everything starts from. Some examples here, how much more frequent this spot come, how flop spots are more common than river spots, as we saw, and how single raised pots are encountered way more than 3-bet pots. So first factor, how often does it come up? But then we have the second one, which is how costly is the spot? And here we spoke about how we only face a river c-bet from the big blind like 0.08% of the time. But making a mistake on this more uncommon spot will end up being significantly more expensive than making a mistake on the flop or pre-flop, simply because of how much money is already in the pot. So when we face a third barrel on the river, the pot just naturally has to be big because already 3 bets have gone in. So knowing how to maneuver these spots is also important, even if they don't come up as often because of how expensive they can be. Then one example would be, let's say, ICM, right? ICM also doesn't come up that often. We don't make final tables very often. It's a very low percentage of the time. But when we do make the final tables, this is where our decisions matter the most in terms of dollar EV instead of actually making money. So understanding ICM, even if it doesn't come up very often as we play, is crucial. I can show you some examples for this, but of course there is also the other way around where it doesn't mean that every uncommon spot is worth more than common spots. For example, we can get into a situation where hijack limps and then cut off over limps and then button raises and we're in the small blind. This spot doesn't really come up almost ever. And at the same time, it's also not important in terms of dollar EV because most of our hands will have very clear decisions. It will be very few hands we struggle with. So this is a spot that is pretty inconsequential. It's gonna show up once in a blue moon. It doesn't cost much. Most of our decisions are clear. We don't need to care about the spot or prioritize it. So, second factor, we need to understand that some uncommon spots are actually very expensive to get wrong. So they should also be prioritized high compared to common ones. And then the third, more self-explanatory factor is how good am I actually in this spot? And the better you are, we are in a situation, the less attention we should spend on it, of course, because our mistakes are also more likely to be marginal. We will, since we're good at the spot, or somewhat good, we will roughly know what to do, and the hand that we will not be sure of will be hands that are on the verge. And so if something is close, making a mistake there will also not be expensive. So allocating a lot of time or prioritizing spots that we're already good at doesn't make too much sense. We don't really want to look for perfection. We want to be good enough in every aspect, for every aspect that matters. So I know that so far maybe I haven't said something super concrete. So for that, if I had to rank the 5 things to prioritize studying, even though, as I said, there is no clear answer, this might not be what is 100% right for you, but if I had to make a list, it would be this list. So, number 1 thing that we have is pre-flop, simply because it is the spot that comes up the most often. but also it is where everything begins. So every other strategy depends on preflop. We need to know our range, we need to know our opponent's range, how the ranges interact on different boards and different situations. And so being very good preflop will help us make better decisions down the line in every node of the game tree. So number one, nail down our preflop ranges. Number two is playing against and from the big blind. As we saw in the examples from the database, big blind play just happens extremely often. So first of all, knowing how to defend against flop c-bets from the big blind, how to check raise, what to fold, what to call, and so on, but also knowing how to c-bet in position against the big blind are extremely important. As we said, it is the most common post-flop scenario, so it's something that we should prioritize and we should be pretty good at. Again, it's not about getting everything perfect. We don't care about perfection. We care about being good enough and having the basic picture nailed down. The third thing would be c-betting out of position and stubbing in position, especially from later positions. So let's say cutoff versus button. The reason for that is that this is another spot that just comes up very, very often as we play. When we raise the cutoff, the button is supposed to continue against us like 25, 27% of the time. So it just happens extremely often as we play, and we need to be able to maneuver both out of position and in position. So this would be my number 3 thing. Number 4 would be ICM, especially preflop. Postflop ICM doesn't come up as often and is not as easy to approach, but preflop ICM is just very, very important. Again, even though it doesn't come up super often as we play, making mistakes, getting things wrong can be really expensive in terms of dollar amount. Whereas, let's say, making a mistake on a flop c-bet in GPD when the tournament starts is not gonna cost that much. It can be maybe like half a big blind mistake, which would be a very small fraction of the total buy-in, whereas an ICM mistake can end up costing several buy-ins. And then the fifth one, where maybe I'm a bit biased, let's be honest, I did make a bounty course after all, would be bounty tournament fundamentals. If you play online, you probably notice that the majority of tournaments now are a bounty tournament in one way or another. PKO, mystery bounty, whatever it may be. Winamax has this space KO, so many variations nowadays. But most of them are bounty tournaments. And so knowing how bounties work, how we should change our strategy, basically having, as I said, the fundamentals is very, very important. Of course, this is different if you mostly play live poker. Bounty tournaments there are way more limited. Once again, I'm going to say that this top 5 list is not what is 100% correct for everyone. But if I had to make a list, this would be the way I would rank it based on the 3 factors that we spoke about. So now, before moving on into how to approach studying, I want to have a look if there are any questions in the chat. Is there a reason we're not using AI? I like making things myself. Preflop also number 1 for cash game players to study. I would assume so, yes, especially because in cash games, postflop happens less often, no ante usually, so people play less hands, so preflop is an even higher portion of the hands you play. Do I recommend Poker Tracker over Hand to Node? Different functionalities for its program for me. Poker Tracker is a bit easier to use for some spot lookup or some analysis. How do you improve your small stake poker online? This is a bit too big and broad of a question. I don't think I can answer it right now. What would I benchmark my own stats against? So there are different websites that give you GTO stats. You can go to some training site. Also, Hand to Node sells some GTO stats to compare yourself with. There are a lot of ways to find these stats. Okay. Now, let's move on to how to actually approach studying topics, especially when some of these topics can be very broad. Now, first, how to approach studying in general. There is, once again, not a clear-cut answer. There are many different approaches. So here, I will just be going over what works for me, the way that I found that is easiest and most effective to study. So, number one thing for me, focus on one topic at a time. When there are so many different topics and all the topics are very layered and very broad, focusing on one of them at a time has been really helpful for me. So let's say I want to start studying cutoff versus big blind at 40 big blinds. I am going to start focusing on that. So I'm not going to look at bottom versus big blind. I'm not going to look at a different stack size. I'm going to focus on one thing at a time until I get pretty good at it, and then I can move on. So let's stick to this example. Let's say we want to start studying how to play cutoff versus big blind at 40 big blinds. Where do we start from? Well, number one thing would be start from the theory, and then we start practicing with examples. So for that, we can just look at a GTO wizard. So let's say cutoff versus big blind. Where do we start from? Preflop. As I said, number one priority. So we would start by learning the cutoff range and then also the big blind defending range, right? Very important to know how the ranges interact, which range is good on which board, which runout, and so on. So first we start with preflop, what to open, what to 3-bet, what to defend. It helps us visualize. Then we go to the next step, which would be c-betting on the flop. So after learning preflop, I would spend a lot of time looking at different board textures and learning how to c-bet from the cutoff, what sizings, what frequencies, and just go pretty deep into that. One very helpful thing are the reports on GVO Wizard, where if we go on the pre-solved thing and we go cutoff, big blind, and we can put any random board, doesn't really matter. GTO Wizard has these reports which help us with studying the theory. So here on the reports, we can filter by, let's say, flop, and we go from like high cards or low cards, and we can see each board, how often do we bet, how often do we check, what sizing do we use, and so on. So this report function is really good for studying the theory. After spending a lot of time and learning the flop theory, then we can start looking into turn, how to construct our turn barreling range, what sizings to use, which cards are good for us, bad for us, and so on. Once we are done with the theory, then we can start moving into actual examples and practice. So for that, I would again use drilling on GTO Wizard or some other similar website or software. So first we start with preflop, then we start with the flop c-betting, then we go turns, then we go reverse, and then we practice. So start from theory and then move towards practice. After that, we of course need to be revising. We need to be practicing again and again. Repetition, very important, but I will touch on that in a bit. So we start from theory, then practice examples. Okay. Then also very important is for us to focus on the bigger picture and not really focus on niche details. We need to care about getting the main strategy right and not some fringe frequency here and there, some super weird complicated line or some hand doing something very weird. This doesn't matter. These are very small details that we can look into down the line. What is very important is to just know roughly the main strategies. And of course, the better we get at a spot, the more we dive deeper into it. For example of this, let's say for post-flop, we're looking at this cutoff versus big blind scenario. So 40 big blinds, cutoff opens, big blind defense, and we get some flop like 9, 6, 4. Big blind checks. And then we want to see how do we c-bet. Right, and we can see here, this strategy has like some small sizing, some a bit bigger, some half pot, some of this, some of that. And if we take a look at a hand like Queen 9, we can see Queen 9 wants to mix a bit small, mix a bit middle, mix a bit big sizing. But this doesn't really matter. So our main approach here should be, okay, this board, what is the main strategy? We want to have a little bit of small sizing, not much, so not very important, but mainly we want to play the big overbet sizing. So the big picture here is on this board, we want to be playing a lot of big sizings and a lot of checking. Everything in the middle is noise. Like the half pot sizing being used 2% of the time, this is irrelevant. It's noise. It doesn't matter. The 1/3 sizing also just doesn't really matter. We can have a small sizing if we want to, but again, big picture is that we want to have big sizing. That's what matters in this spot. The same can also apply to preflop. We need to care about the main big picture. Let's say cutoff opens and we want to learn the big blinds range preflop. So we see, okay, we're supposed to 3-bet a bit of 10-9, a bit of 10-8, a bit of this, a bit of that. Does it really matter if we 3-bet 10-9 over 10-8? No, these are pretty much the same hand. What matters is knowing roughly where to draw our bluffs from. Then if instead of 40 big blinds, we go to 50 big blinds. Well, now we can see we use Jack-10 instead of 10-9. Again, does it really matter? No. The main idea is that at 50, we can see now we start using a lot of suited hands to 3-bet. So this is the big picture, that at 40, we use some offsuit hands, but once we go 50 or deeper, we start using a lot of suited connected hands. Our focus should be on the big changes and not, oh, instead of 10-8, we go into a bit of 10-9. Oh, now here, we don't use 10-9 that much, we use more Jack-9. These are low frequencies, same hand, doesn't matter. So 50 big blinds, all of these suited hands. 40 big blinds, none of these suited hands. This is what matters. Next, important to take notes. At least for me, it has helped me out a lot when studying similar concepts. Like let's say after going cutoff versus big blind, you go button versus big blind. It's good to write down the differences that we have because most strategies will be the same. Like ace-high boards will still be range bet even if we're cutoff or button or hijack. But then what actually changes between the positions? Good to write it down so that we can revisit it often, easily, without having to go through the entire study routine again. We can focus on the differences and remember them. And then, finally, repetition. Practicing the spots we've studied again and again, over and over, is going to be very important. There are so many things for us to learn that we can never learn everything, and also it's easy for us to forget. So often practicing and repeating what we've already studied is key to it becoming second nature. So I brought up the cutoff versus button example, or cutoff versus big blind, sorry. So once we're done with that and we move to, let's say, button versus big blind, we will often need to revisit cutoff versus big blind again and run practice spots and make sure our knowledge is up to date and we freshen up what we've studied before. So quick summary, how to approach studying. Focus on one topic at a time. Start from theory, then move to practice. Focus on the main strategy. We don't care about small, minor, details, low frequency stuff. Irrelevant. Then helps to take notes, especially of the differences between similar concepts. And then studying it once and practicing a few times is not enough. We need to be revisiting it time after time after time to get better and just freshen up all the time. Okay, I will check for questions again. Let's see. How about live cash games play? Multi-way spots would be about half the time. 4 would be reverse spots. The number 5, multi-way, may be higher. Yes, correct. This makes a lot of sense because, as you said, in live cash games, especially lower stakes, multi-way spots do happen way more often than they should. So practicing those is very important. What tools are essential? This is the next part. I'm going to talk about the tools I'm using once we're done with the questions. What would be the best way to know which aspect of your game to study if you play mainly live and don't have hundreds of stats to look at? So for that, you would have to prioritize based on what happens more often on the games you play. So again, pre-flop, big blind play, playing against the big blind, all of these things, and also which area you feel you lack the most knowledge. Most GTO solvers provide what to do but do not share why they are doing it. How do you understand what the solver is making? Recommendation versus just being told what to do. Right. So for that, it comes down to not trying to learn the strategy by heart, not just memorizing, but understanding why. And a lot of this comes from preflop. I will bring a practical example. We were looking at the 9-6-4 board where cutoff is betting big or checking. So instead of just looking at this and trying to memorize it, it's important to understand why do we do this? And the answer is here, the cutoff has a lot of middling hands, whether it is ace highs or some 6x, let's say 4x, 7s, 8s. So these middle hands are doing pretty good here, but if they bet, they don't really accomplish much because the big blind will fold hands we beat, but continue with hands that beat us. Also, these hands are not particularly good at facing check raises. Also on this board, the big blind will end up having a lot of gut shots and a lot of backshot flush draws, so small sizings will not be particularly effective because the big blind just has so many hands like, let's see, let me just show you. Hands like, Jack 5 backshot flush draw, 10-5 backshot flush draw, Jack 7 backshot flush draw, Jack 3. All of these, one high card backdoor straight backshot flush draw, the small sizing doesn't really work against. So both because of how our range is constructed and how many of these kind of hands the big blind has, big sizings is the way to go here. Again, just an example of illustrating how to approach this spot. Not just look at it and try to memorize it, but try to figure out why. What in the range construction leads to us playing this way? It seems like I made a mistake on how I've studied in the past. I would focus on preflop, but I would study preflop. Okay. Right. Nice. What is the best way to study range charts? I have difficulty memorizing them all. So I would say you start from, let's say, early position where the range is tighter, and then you see what do we add each step of the way. So EP, we open, let's say, 18% or whatever this is, 19%. And then when we go to under the gun 1, well, we start adding some extra hands. What do we add? Some more offsuit broadways, some more of these. And then from the low jack, we expand even more in this category, and then even more, and then even more. With so many stack sizes and different positions, you will never really know down to the T exactly what hands you open, but you're going to be pretty close, and that's what matters. Like, let's say here you end up folding queen 4 from the cutoff or opening queen 3 from the cutoff. Does it really matter? Not really. Do I publish this heuristic as a company? Does it offer a detailed breakdown, structured learning agenda? I think there are some courses about what to study, like I think from the ground up it's called, but I'm not very well versed in it. It's not my course, so I'm sure someone else can offer more input here. Best way to practice exploits using logic, but also node locking. GTO Wizard, especially the premium subscription with the AI solve, allows you to easily node lock for strategies, how you think your opponent will play, and you can see how to adjust to it. What grind to study ratio do I suggest for a low stakes player? I would say about 50-50, which sounds easy, but just think about every time you fire a session, you play for like 6, 7, 8 hours if you play tournaments. So you should study for just this much on the off days. You shouldn't study for 2 hours. That's not enough. If you play for 8, you should study for 8. For flop and turn reports ICM, which one should we focus on? 5% left, bubble, etc. So I would say bubble more important, and then some final table stuff maybe. Try to topic on one topic per week. Picking a topic, how long to stay on a topic. So how long would have to depend on how quickly you can get to a satisfying position of knowing that you know the basics, you know enough, and then you can move on to another topic where you don't know that much. In order to know what is enough, you just have to wait to your knowledge on the other topics. For example, let's say cutoff big blind, right? When do I know enough? Well, if you're completely clueless how to play button versus big blind, once you've nailed down the basics of cutoff versus big blind, you can move on to button versus big blind. It just really is a matter of comparing. How close to the bubble would I start adjusting ranges significantly from GPV? Complicated answer. I don't want to get into too much of that, but basically it depends on how many starting stacks we have, how big is the min cache. It's not a clear answer. Can I buy flop reports from you? I don't think so, no. Okay, for that, let me move on to the next part of the presentation, which is exactly what a question said, what tools to use when studying. Main one, number one, and I know I've said it already 10 times, believe me, I'm not sponsored, but it is GTO Wizard. The thing is, it has so many functionalities all in one place that I think is the number one thing that pretty much everyone should have. Maybe some of the sims are not super accurate, some of the ICM solutions will not be exactly what you're looking for, but it will be good enough for almost every usage. GTO Wizard has made PioSolver almost obsolete at this point. For me personally, besides my already pre-solved sims, I only use it for some post-flop ICM situations, just because I have it. If I was starting today, I would say PioSolver pretty much zero need at this point. GTO Wizard offers enough of a good alternative and has everything in one place. So I would very much recommend GTO Wizard or similar kind of software if you hate it for some reason. Next one that I use a lot is HRC. This is tournament specific and it's used mainly for ICM spots. So GTO Wizard has an ICM database, but for me, I want to be able to study the exact ICM spot that I am facing. And for that, I need HRC to input the correct payouts and all the stack sizes and everything, so for it to be a simulation of the exact spot I was facing. So HRC, very, very important. And I will do a quick guide at the end for HRC, because I've also had this question like, how do I use it? What settings do I use? And so on. And then the third one that I think is still quite useful is Equilab. And Equilab is a free software, which is a bit more basic, but can be very useful for just simple equity calculations, like how much equity does my hand have on this board against the range or against another hand. And I can give you an example of this, even though something seems pretty basic, how it can be very useful nowadays. So I had a student share a hand with me recently where he had pocket jacks with the jack of spades, it's relevant. And there was a board, ace of spades, king of spades, four of diamonds, and the turn was the nine of spades. And my student folded to a 40% pot bet on the turn with pocket jacks with the jack of the flush draw. The board is ace, king, four, nine, three spades, we have jacks with the jack of spades. And my student folded to a 40% pot bet on the turn. And the problem here is just how much equity pocket jacks have. Against a hand like ace nine, which is two pair, against ace nine, we have 25% equity. Against two pair, we have 25%. And when we face a 40% pot bet, we need less than 25 to call. If we go to the calculator, if our opponent bets 40, then we need to call 40 for 180. So we need like 22%. So we are simply not really allowed to fold this hand. Even if our opponent literally shows us like a set or two pair, we just have to call because of the equity. And basic thing, I know, but you will be surprised how often mistakes like this come up, even from professionals, where you're just thinking, oh, I'm behind or whatever it may be, but you're not really thinking about your actual odds and the equity you have versus the range. So Equilab, simple, free software, still pretty useful nowadays. A lot of the other software that we used to use in the past, like PioSolver or Simple Three-Way or Monker Solver, Rocket Solver, Always Solvers, while they still have their uses and maybe they can give you more accurate results compared to GTO Wizard, they are much less significant and I would say close to obsolete. GTO Wizard can do ICM, can do three-way, can do whatever you need it to do. So these other ones, as I said, maybe you can get a bit more accurate outputs using a dedicated solver, but GTO Wizard will be good enough and will be everything in one place, in one application, with one subscription. Before the Q&A, we can do the quick HRC kind of tutorial. So for this, I have a spot I saved recently, and this is from a PKO tournament. What else would it be? Which is somewhat deep. We are 35 players left out of 107 with 13 paid. So somewhat close to the bubble, but not really. And we are a big stack. We open the cutoff, and the big blind jams 18 big blinds, but he has 2 starting bounties. So his bounties here are worth quite a lot, and his stack is pretty small. Our stack is pretty big. So I want to check how wide should I be calling in this spot. So what I need to do is take a screenshot of the spot. We need to show the actual hand, of course, but then also we need the lobby of the tournament. We need to know the payouts, we need to know the average stack, and also the average bounty. Pretty good to have that on display as well. So once we have all that, we open HRC and then we create a new hand. And we start by filling in all the payouts. I can open the actual hand in question, just so it is clear. Here we are. So we would fill out all the payouts. So first place gets this, then this, then this, then this. Make sure we have PKO mode enabled because it is a bounty tournament after all. Then we need to fill out all the table information. So the stack sizes and the bounties. For small blind, big blind, and ante, I just use a simplified version where the big blind is always 10, the small blind is always 5, and the ante is whatever equivalent. So here, 1.25. Then we need to make sure we allow a decent amount of players to see the flop. 4 is almost always going to be enough, unless we want to look at a 500 spot, which doesn't really come up, like 5-way pots don't really happen. And then for this scenario, we are 35 players left. So we want to select multi-table ICM. Then with all of this filled out, we click next. And then we have the page where we set up all the other stacks. So what we need to do here is input how many players you have left, which would be 35. And then we need to input what is the average stack size. And we can see here, big blind is 6K, average stack size is 305K, which is 51 big blinds. So we will put 510, so 51 big blinds is the average. And then we can finally use the average bounty. We can see here it is 957, so 957. Then we click next, and this is the final setup, which is the post-flop and pre-flop settings. For pre-flop, we want to allow the open sizes. So here we min-raise, so min-raise. And then we have multiple options regarding 3-bet sizings from in position, out of position, 4-bet sizings, limps, all these kind of options, which we can tailor to each spot we want to study. For my spot here, in position 3-betting to like 3 times my sizing seems correct, and small blind, let's say 4 times my raise is also correct. Big blind, maybe 6 big blinds, 5.5, since he only has 18. So I want to make sure all of these settings are correct. Then I want to make sure I allow cold calls and closing flats. This means that people are allowed to flat my open, and the big blind is supposed to overcall against the a raise and a call. Then we have the post-flop settings. So these ones are pretty simple. We just need to make sure we have set the geometric. So here, just setting heads up, multi-way, 25, 66. This is going to be enough. We don't really need to do too many different settings. This allows for multiple bet sizes on each street. And then finally, we care about the flop subsets, bottom right. So what does this mean? What is a flop subset? Well, what HRC will do once we click finish is it will start running simulations of the parameters of the spot on different numbers of flops. The more flops we run, the more accurate the results will be. For example, if we were to select 60 flops, well, these 60 flops which are generated might be more ace-high heavy. So then HRC will prefer ace high hands. Maybe they are 10 high heavy. So then a 10 will overperform. So we need to have enough flops so that the flops are varied and are representative of reality. And using 4,000 for the flop, 1,000 turn, 1,000 river would be enough. Once this is done, we click finish. And then after we click finish, HRC will give us a rough solution of the spot. But we are not done. The last step is we need to select the spot we want. So in this case, it would be cutoff raising because we are the cutoff here. And we get to click the green arrow over here. I'll just select another hand, which is false. So we click the green arrow and we go selected subtree. So we want to run this specific tree, not the full tree, the selected subtree. And we need to choose an accuracy. So how long should we run it for? And usually it counts as CI, which means iterations, whatever, it doesn't matter what it means. We want it to be below 5. So we would put, let's say 5, and then we have HRC starting to run. And when it's done, our spot will be solved. Important to know, HRC takes post-flop into account. So all the recommendations are assuming all the post-flop play as well. I know maybe this was a bit quick about how to set it up, but you can watch the VOD if you want to repeat it. I thought I shouldn't spend too much time explaining, because you can just watch it back and you see what I've done. All right, so before the Q&A, just a quick summary of everything. Quick recap. So first, how to prioritize studying. It depends on how often the spot comes up, how expensive a mistake is, how good we are at the spot. How to approach studying. Well, we start by looking at the theory, and then we practice, and we look at one spot at a time, and then we practice again, and then we repeat it again. For software, GTO Wizard, number 1, has everything, then HRC, especially if you play tournaments for ICM, and also Equilab, free, simple program, helps a lot with equity calculations.